environment. You know, when Barack Obama talks about the fact that his massive government expansion isn't going to cost average Americans anything, it's only going to be paid for by the rich, that's all a sham. They're not raising taxes on the rich nearly enough. In fact, they're barely raising them on the rich. And in fact, there's not as many rich people left to tax. And the more they tax them, the fewer there's going to be. But the problem is you have this huge growth of government. It has to be paid for. And even if we succeed in borrowing the money from the Chinese for a while, theoretically we have to pay it back. So we have to raise taxes in the future by an even larger amount than we would have raised them today. But again, I don't see that as a realistic political possibility. They're going to print money. They're going to print all this money to pay for all this government. But that doesn't mean it's free. That doesn't mean that the average American gets all this government for nothing. No. When the government prints money, they rob every American citizen of his purchasing power. It hurts most people who are retired and who are living off their accumulated, saved purchasing power. But they tax every American wage earner whose wages are constantly being debased. And when he goes to the grocery store and he sees that food is more expensive, or he goes to the gas pump and sees gas is more expensive, that's Obama's tax. That's the consequences. That's how he's paying for all this government. And I said the big problem is our economy is so malinvested after years and years of reliance on cheap money and excess consumer spending. We've got an economy that doesn't work. We've got an economy that's unsustainable because in order to sustain it, we have to rely on this dynamic where the world lends and produces, and we borrow and consume indefinitely. And we know from the housing bubble or Bernie Madoff that nothing that is unsustainable will go on forever. So we desperately need to allow free market forces back into this economy to make it more efficient, to make it more productive, so that we can have real recovery. We can. I mean, we could be a very prosperous nation again, but it's never going to happen if we abandon every single principle that led to that prosperity in the first place. If we're going to try to recreate prosperity based on government allocation of resources, based on politics instead of market forces, instead of the Adam Smith invisible hand, if we're going to use the heavy hand of the state to try to figure out what companies need capital, we will never get out of this hole. We will just continuously dig deeper and deeper until it's so deep that there's no way out. You know, if you look at how ridiculous a lot of this is, when we sent Hillary Clinton to China as Secretary of the Treasury, and she's there, and we're sending our embassies to China all the time because, it's like a Wall Street, dog and pony show, and they're slapping all this lipstick on a pig, and they're trying to get our creditors to keep buying our debt. And, when she goes over there, it's the same old nonsense. You got no choice. We're all in this together. You've got to lend us all this money. You've got to buy all these bonds, because if you don't buy them, then, we're not going to buy your stuff. So what you got to do is tax your citizens and take their money away from them and give it to us so that we can lend it to our citizens so they can use that money to buy the goods that your citizens produced. Now, what kind of crazy policy is that? I mean, if anyone has read that book, a book, Tom Sawyer, by Mark Twain, and there's a passage in there where, he convinces where Tom Sawyer convinces all of his friends to do his chores, to whitewash his fence. And not only does he get them to do it, but he gets them to pay for the privilege. Well, little did Samuel Clemens know when he wrote that little passage that it would one day form the basis of the global economy. But we've conned them, and I think what the Chinese are going to decide, I think they've already decided this, is that, wait a minute, Clinton's approach doesn't really make sense for China. China has a better approach. Why not leave the purchasing power with the Chinese citizens? That way they have their jobs and their stuff, right? Because the only reason we work, politicians make believe that we all want to work. I don't know about you. I'd prefer not to have to work. Most people don't want to work, right? If given the choice of collecting the same paycheck and not showing up, most people wouldn't clock in. So we work because we want things. We want the productivity associated with that labor. Well, right now the Chinese don't get that. They get the work and we get the productivity. We did that for a while in the United States. It was called slavery. And it wasn't that good deal for the slaves. When they were freed, oh, fine. I think the same thing is going to happen. And people say, well, the whole economy is going to collapse over there because they're an export-driven economy. No, they're not. They're a production-driven economy. They don't have to export their production. They can keep their production. The fact that they export it benefits us. But if they stop exporting it, right, as I said, if China was alone in the world and they were producing all this stuff, would it be some kind of national epidemic, some disaster? You know, we got all this stuff, we don't know what to do with it. You know, it's America that would be in trouble, because if you take China away and all the other countries that supply us, all we'd have is a bunch of paper, and we'd have nothing to do with it, because there'd be nothing on the shelves. We just have pieces of paper. So they're going to figure this out, and the world is going to change. The dynamics are going to change. The production is going to be reclaimed by the people who rightfully deserve it. And America is going to see its standard of living dramatically reduced to reflect the fact that based on years and years of bad monetary and fiscal policy that have shut down the free market system in this country, we have allowed the real wealth-producing components of our economy to shrivel, and we've replaced it with the facade or the false consumer-driven service sector economy. And as that economy implodes, despite all the government's efforts to prop it back up, our standard of living is going to fall. And as investors, we need to reposition our portfolios. We need to reallocate our wealth so that we own the currencies that are going to gain value, so that we own assets. We own real assets in countries whose economies are going to grow, whose standards of living are going to rise once they're freed from the burden, I say it is a burden, of having to prop up and support 300 million Americans. It's going to be the same way as at the end of the Second World War, when the war ended. We didn't have an economic collapse because 10 million soldiers were unemployed. They found jobs in civilian employment that were more productive. You know, maybe we had to fight that war, right? But when we fought the war, all of our resources were consumed by the military. Our factories were making tanks and bombs, and they weren't making sewing machines, and they weren't making automobiles and basic things, you know, margarine, nylon. You know, there were shortages. Consumer goods were rationed in the United States so that the resources could be used by the military. You know, if we had government economists back in 1944, 1945, we'd still be fighting that war. They would have said to Hoover or to Roosevelt, we can't invade Iwo Jima. You know, we can't go into Normandy. If we end the war, our wartime economy is going to collapse. What about all the factories? What are they, if they can't make bombs, what are they going to do? Well, it changed. They just retooled. They made stuff for civilian purposes, and the economy benefited. We had a post-war boom. The same thing's going to happen. You know, trying to call this decoupling, you know, we're going to have this decoupling. And the reason that decoupling is going to be good for the world is because what the world is decoupling is not the engine, but the caboose. And if you decouple the caboose, well, you can move even faster. And so that's going to happen. It's not going to happen without any kind of friction. There are a lot of special interests that benefit from the status quo. A lot of politicians or certain businesses that benefit from shipping all this stuff to America and this infrastructure that's there. And there's some resistance. But ultimately, the free market will prevail, and China will retool, and every other country will retool. And they're going to make things for themselves. There's 1 billion people, 1.3 billion people in China. There's 1 billion people in India. We're worried about consumption. There's 2.3 billion people there, and we're worried about consumption. We need to worry about production. We need to worry about saving. There's plenty of people that will consume when we stop. But if we're ever going to restart that consumption again, which is something that we want to do, we need to recreate the conditions that made us such a prosperous country in the first place. We became rich not because we were the biggest taxer, but because we barely taxed. Regulations, you know, the government says that that we have a problem on Wall Street because of lack of regulation. I can tell you, I own a Wall Street brokerage firm. They're regulating me to death already. And now they want to layer on even more. What we need is the government to get out of the way so that the free market can work. And if it is allowed to work, if Americans can rebuild their savings, if we can reduce the size of government. You know, I hear a lot of people talking about we need tax cuts. You're damn right we need tax cuts, but we can't cut taxes until we cut government. We need to make government a lot smaller. And if it's smaller, then it's less expensive. And if it's less expensive, we don't need high taxes. So what we need is a government to shrink so that it's less of a burden on the productive part of the economy. But what is our government doing now? It's getting bigger. It's doing the opposite of what it needs to do. We're trying to dig our way out of this hole, and the government's got its foot on the shovels. How can we get out? But if we're going to, right, if we're going to be a prosperous nation again, which I hope and I believe that we can be, we've got to change the thinking in Washington. We've got to stand up and defend the free market. When George Bush, in the waning days of his presidency, said that we have to abandon free market principles in order to save the free market, he was dead wrong. First, he was wrong on the fact of abandoning those principles. George Bush abandoned free market principles the day he took the oath of office. That was the problem. We need to embrace free market principles like never before, because that's the only way to get out of this mess. And you talk about principles. What good are your principles if the minute there's a problem, you abandon them? If we think government works good in a crisis, then it should work good all the time. To say, well, things are bad, we need more government, well then why not when they're good? It's precisely when things are bad that we need capitalism and freedom. You know, when the economy is sound, as it was maybe even in the 1930s, as Japan was, I think, fundamentally in the 1980s and still is today, when the economy is sound, you can withstand all the stupid things that the government does. If you're a strong economy, you can afford, you know, government. But when you're a weak economy, when your economy is in shambles like ours is, you can't afford it. We're too broke to afford it. You know, of all the times that we can't afford more government or bigger government, it's right now. But of course, if you talk about shrinking government, the Keynesians that are running this country, we can't do that. We can't shrink government because if we lay government workers off, there's more unemployment. Temporarily maybe, but how are government workers getting their employment? They're stealing or they're usurping resources from the private sector. Those government jobs exist at the expense of private sector jobs, at the expense of jobs that might actually produce things. Because the government workers aren't producing anything. They need to, their salary has to come from the productivity of others. And the fewer people who are actually producing, the lower our standard of living. And as I said, we're not going to continue to con China and the rest of Southeast Asia and the world, not just, you know, production goods. Look at all the oil we import. We're not going to be able to import all this oil and pay for it with paper, pay for it with dollars. That's going to come to an end. And prices are going to have to go up for Americans because of the reduced value of our currency. So if all this is happening, how are we going to solve this problem? How are we ever going to recover? The answer is we're not until we change. That's why I said at the beginning that, you know, the fat lady isn't even here yet, because we're still digging the ditch deeper. We're still trying to stimulate. We're still making the problem worse. And we're not going to solve the problem until we identify it. And then once we identify it, we have to take proper action. And that action is rolling back all the government, ending the bailouts, ending the stimulus, letting companies fail, letting people lose money, holding people responsible for their bad decisions and their irrational investments, and allowing free market forces to restore the prosperity that our government stole from us. Thank you. What? Huh? Oh, one more thing. One more thing I forgot to say. I am going to have my first kind of informal fundraiser at 3:30 this afternoon in my hotel suite.